Welcome. Today we are going to look at the PowerBasic console compiler and produce our first executable application. So, starting with clicking on the shortcut to the PowerBasic console compiler, we'll launch the application. Now, for ease of visibility, I've actually increased the size of both the font in the application here and the toolbar, just so you can see everything clearly. But if we click on the first icon on the toolbar, this allows us to actually create the template for a program. We have a number of options. We're going to pick the first one, which is the console program. I'll cover the rest later. If we click on console program, here it is. There are two key points at the top of the screen, compile exe and dim all. Compile exe means that we're telling the application we're going to create an executable file. The second line, the dim all, is instructing the compiler that all variables referenced must be dimensioned before use, which is always a very safe thing. The main function in here is the pbmain function. This function is the first function executed by the program when it launches. You can then call as many functions or subroutines after that as you wish. Now, in this one, we're going to put something really simple, which is going to send to the console. Our standard hello world. Now, because when we run this, the console is going to launch and then the program is going to finish almost straight away, we want the console to stay on screen long enough for us to see it. So we'll put a command in that says just wait until the keyboard's actually pressed on the keyboard. Now if we run this one now, it will first ask us to save it. So we'll give it a name with a .bas extension. And there it's running. So there we go, hello world on the screen. Not terribly exciting, but it works. Press the button and it disappears. Now, we'll set this up a wee bit differently. We will put a command in to label our console window. So if we run this, we will then have a caption at the top that says our console. Normally with console applications, you don't expect a user to be sitting watching them all the time. Usually these kind of console applications are things that run in the background, things that process files, things that perform services. These could be, you can write your own web server in the console compiler, you can write your own CGI web applications, which are called on the web server. Again, these applications are never actually seen by a user, but they do perform a function in the background. Now that we've got our hello world, we want to do something with the actual application. We want to get it to perform some kind of task. So, what shall we do for our first application? What we could do is something that opens a file and has a look at what's inside the file. Seems a reasonable thing to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function and we're going to call this function. So down here we will put in a new function. And we'll call it read the file. Now, using the function word at the beginning tells the program it's going to be a function as opposed to a subroutine. For those of you who are beginners to the basic language, the basic difference between a function and a subroutine is that a function can be called with parameters. It will return a value, which can be a long variable, it can be an integer, it could be a string, it could be a number of other things as well. But a subroutine in itself is something you call again with parameters, but it doesn't actually return a value. So in this one here, we're going to call our function from up here. Now, we want to test what comes back from this function. So if the function is successful, we want to return a value. So since it's a simple boolean, we'll return a true or false. So if it returns true, then we will run this piece of code here where we're saying the function worked. If it didn't, we'll run this piece of code here. Now we can put a message out to the console just on the off chance that somebody's actually monitoring this to see what is actually going to come out. So if we have this down here, somewhere inside this function, we're going to have to define the value of the function so we can pass it back to the PB main routine. So what we'll put in here is we will put a function equals, and it's either going to be a true or false. So we will define the true and false shortly. We'll say in this case it's true. And this definition with the percentage sign in front of the value is basically a constant. It's a numeric constant which we're setting up here. So if we run this one, what should happen if I've keyed this correctly is it should call this function. It should come down here, return just the value true, and then it should print out it worked, which it has. If we change the value at the bottom to false, then it should come back to say it didn't work, which it has. So we'd like to actually read a proper file now. So what we want to do is we want to create a file in our folder, and we'll make it a straightforward text file called my file. Now this file is going to contain information. So what shall we put in this file? Okay. Something really easy. Right, okay. We will save this one. And this is the file that we're going to read within our program. So, we want to test it, first of all, if it exists. So we want to pass to read the file, possibly the name of the file we want to read. So what we can do to save typing it many times is we create another constant called myfile.text. Let's call my file equals myfile.text, and then we'll pass it in here as a string. So in our function, the very first thing you want to do, you want to test to see if the file exists. If the file doesn't exist, then obviously you will return a false. That's better. So we're testing here to see is there's an inbuilt function to PowerBasic called isFile, which basically returns a true or false on whether the file physically exists in its location. Now we haven't actually told it the location yet, we've all given it the file name, but we'll come to that in a moment. So if it doesn't find a file, it will return false. If it does find a file, it's going to return true. But what we can do again, one of the inbuilt commands is exe.path, which will return to the program the executable path that it currently sits in. Now we know the file is actually sitting in the same directory as the application. If we bring that back on screen, there's our myfile.txt, and it's in the same folder as our hello-world.exe. So it will find it in there quite happily. So if we run this now, since the file's there, it should come back to say it worked. If we run it now, it says it's worked. If we go in and we change the name of the file to something else, it should come back. Well, this program is actually still running. Let's just close the program off. It should come back to say it didn't work, which again is perfect. So it's correctly identifying the fact that the file does actually exist. So if the file does exist, we're wanting to open the file up. It's always useful to comment your code. So to open this file now, we have to use some of the file commands. Now here we could actually hard code and put a number in here for the file handle, but ideally, since your program could be opening lots of files, you want to use a specific file handle that the system can actually provide for you, which is this. Now what we're doing is we're using a variable and asking the system to provide the next tree file handle, and we'll use that as our file handle to open this. Now this variable we're going to define. Since we've got the dim all turned on, we want all variables actually dimensioned. So we'll make it long, but local to this particular function. Now, this will open a file, and obviously eventually we're going to have to close the file, as so. Now, since we've already tested that the file actually exists, there should be no problem in actually opening it, in theory. However, there's always a possibility that between the time we test it and the time we open it, something happens to the file. So ideally, we want to put a bit of error handling in here. Now, PowerBasic supports the try, catch, finally, end try structure. So we're going to try and open the file. If we don't open the file, then we can do something. So we can make the function equal to false, and only if it's successfully opened will we say that the function is true. So we'll put that up there, so that for some reason although we've detected the file exists, when we try and open it, we can't open it for some reason. Now what you can do is we can, if the file doesn't open, put a message out to the console of whatever the error was, because if you do have an error, we go into the catch section and you can actually print that error out to the console. Of course, since no one's probably going to be watching this program when it runs, you can actually send these errors out to a file, basically have a log file which you can actually append all the errors into. Now, we've now opened the file, but we haven't done anything yet. We want to actually read the file in. Now, when we looked earlier at the file itself, when we created it, there's our file and there's our text. So we basically have three lines in. We have a header line, which contains the name of each of the fields, and we have 2 data lines. Now this could be just 2 data lines, or it could be 2 million data lines. It doesn't really matter from the point of view of what we're actually doing. But if we go back here and say we want to read in the first line, I'm going to put from long file, and we want to put that value into a string variable, which we haven't defined yet, so we'll have to define that up here. So what we'll try is we'll just try put this out to the screen and run our program. So what we're doing here is we are opening the file, we're reading one line and we're putting the line out. So all we should get is the header line here. So we try running that one. There we go. There's our first line going out and we're seeing it worked. So the function will always have returned true. Now obviously we want to read a bit more than just the first line. But if we read the first line, we know that's the headers. So what we'll do is we will create another variable called headers, and we'll put that first line into the headers. Now we don't need to pump that out to the console. Now having got our first line, we know there are other lines in here, but we don't know how many there are because we haven't looked yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a loop, a while loop. Basically, while we are not at the end of the file handle, this loop is going to continue running until it gets to the end of the file, however many lines that is, whether it's 2 lines or 2 million. And each time it runs around this loop, we're going to pick up the next line into this str data variable, and we can then do things with it. So if we're doing it that way, let's just chuck this out to the console and run a program. There we go, there's our 2 data lines appearing on the screen. Again, just as expected. But perhaps we don't want all the data, and we want to split up the data that's actually in our file, as we have a first name, a surname and an address. But we're just interested in the surname. How would we get the surname out of that string? It is delimited by commas, so what we're going to do is we're going to use another command that's inbuilt to the Power Basic compiler, which is the parse command. So we will create another variable called surname. We want to pick up the surname from our data line. But how do we get it? Now we know the data will be held within the str data variable because it's the whole address line in there. So we use a command called parse. One thing traditionally BASIC has always been very good at doing is actually parsing strings. Now in this case there are 3 parameters we need. First of all is the first parameter is the variable holding all the data we're interested in. The second variable will be the delimiter of the file, which in this case is a comma. And the third parameter is which element are we actually looking for. Now if we looked at our file again, we would see that the first name is the first parameter, the surname is the second parameter, and the address is the third. So we're interested in perhaps the surname, so that's the second one. So if we look at the second, our surname is then going to be put into this surname variable. What we'll do then is we will just throw that out to the console just to prove we can do it. And if we run that now, there we go, Smith and Jones. We're getting the surnames coming out, so we're quite easily identifying those. So if we wanted to pick up the forename separately, we can do exactly the same thing. Only difference this time, it's coming from the first element. And just to finish off the idea, we can have that. Now obviously this doesn't handle things like embedded commas, it's part of a later video. But if we do this, we can then put out the information that we're actually after. So we could actually put it out in a different format. There we go. Now, as you'll see with PowerBasic, it does produce very small executables. This executable we're doing is only 27K in size at the moment. And every time you compile a PowerBasic application, there's always a log file produced, and the log file tells you how long it took to compile, which is always very short, and what it's actually included. Now, we haven't included any libraries or anything, but the libraries will be part of the next video. Thank you for watching this video.